There are holiday traditions that fade quietly, and then there are the ones that leave a mark on the people who shared them. When you talk to those who once stood close to Michael Jackson, you hear a pattern. The world saw his moonwalk, the sequined gloves, the lights and noise. But behind closed doors, the man they knew kept a soft spot for the simple comforts of Christmas. Not the gifts, not the spectacle, the food, and especially the desserts that reminded him of home, family, and moments when life still felt small. Tonight, we're opening the recipe boxes that rarely left the kitchen counters of Encino and Neverland. Some came from his mother, passed down the way Southern families have done for generations. Others came from private chefs who watched his eyes light up when the smell of cinnamon or warm chocolate floated through the room. A few became traditions he created on his own, shaped by late-night cravings after long rehearsals or holiday gatherings he tried to make feel normal. These dishes weren't just treats, they were anchors. They held memories of childhood Christmas mornings, crowded kitchens, and the rare moments when he could simply be a son, a brother, or a father. And while the performances, tours, and headlines have filled books, these quiet pieces of his life rarely make the spotlight. So let's step into that world, a world of handwritten cards, family favorites, and desserts that carried more meaning than most people ever realized. These are the lost Michael Jackson Christmas dessert recipes that shaped the holidays of one of the most celebrated artists in history. Number 1, the Neverland Eggnog Custard. You can almost picture it, a quiet December evening at Neverland Ranch, lights glowing in every corner, the staff finishing up their final rounds, and Michael slipping into the kitchen for something simple that reminded him of the holidays. The Neverland Eggnog Custard wasn't flashy. It wasn't a chef's showpiece. It was a spoon-soft, velvety dessert he reached for when he wanted comfort more than anything else. It had roots far older than Neverland itself. Eggnog custards were common in Black Southern households throughout the mid-1900s. Families served them warm, not cold, and always with fresh nutmeg grated right over the top. Katherine Jackson grew up with that tradition, and she carried it into her own home. Her version leaned a little sweeter, with a texture halfway between pudding and flan. For Michael, it tasted like the holidays of his childhood in Gary, long before the fame, long before the touring, long before Christmas had to fit between rehearsals and interviews. By the time he owned Neverland, the custard had changed again. One of the longtime cooks added a touch of vanilla bean and a small swirl of whipped cream on top. Michael liked that the dessert still felt familiar, but had a little magic to it, the same way he approached music and storytelling. He often asked for it late at night during December, when the ranch was quiet and the only sound came from the fountains outside. It mattered for another reason. Holidays were complicated for him. Fame had taken him away from a typical childhood, and Neverland became his way of recreating what he felt he missed. The ranch turned Christmas into a celebration of wonder, not just for him, but for the kids and families he invited. But even in a place full of lights and grand decorations, he still gravitated towards simple flavors. The custard grounded him. It reminded him of being a kid crowded around a small kitchen table with his brothers, trading jokes and sharing desserts. Catherine stretched to feed 9 children. There was also a bittersweet detail that makes this recipe feel even more lost. When Neverland's staff changed over the years, so did the food traditions. The cook who perfected the eggnog custard left during the ranch's quieter period in the early 2000s, and the handwritten recipe card disappeared with her. It never surfaced publicly. No one photographed it. No one archived it. It simply lived inside the memories of a few people who worked there during those peak holiday seasons. That's part of what makes this dessert compelling today. It isn't just another custard. It's a small window into how Michael tried to create a private holiday world that felt safe, warm, and familiar. a quiet favorite tucked inside one of the most famous properties in America. Number 2. Katherine's old-fashioned sweet potato pie. If you want to understand Michael Jackson's connection to Christmas, you have to start with his mother's kitchen. Long before Neverland, long before world tours and platinum albums, there was a small house in Gary, Indiana, where the smell of roasting sweet potatoes meant Christmas was getting close. Katherine Jackson's old-fashioned sweet potato pie wasn't just dessert. It was a ritual. It anchored the season, even when money was tight and the house felt crowded with 9 kids and a single oven that always seemed too small. Sweet potato pie has a long history in African American homes. Enslaved cooks in the South adapted it from European custard pies, turning it into something uniquely their own. By the mid-20th century, it had become a holiday essential in Black households across the country. Katherine learned the recipe from her own mother, and by the time she had children of her own, she had it down to muscle memory. No measuring cups, no written instructions, just instinct. For Michael, that pie tasted like the safest place he knew. When the Jackson 5 began rising through the ranks of Motown, their Christmas schedules filled with rehearsals, television specials, and studio recordings. Holidays suddenly had deadlines. But no matter how busy the family became, Katherine still made her sweet potato pies. Sometimes she baked them late at night after the kids were asleep so they'd wake up to the smell. Sometimes she carried them to hotels when the family traveled during the season. Michael always said the flavor reminded him of home more than anything else on the table. There's a reason it mattered so much to him. Fame came fast. Childhood moved too quickly. The pie became a quiet line of continuity in a life that rarely stopped. Even later, when he was an adult in Los Angeles, he would call home in December and ask if his mother was baking. If she visited him around the holidays, she brought one wrapped in foil, just like she did when he was young. What makes the story even more emotional is how easily this recipe could have been lost. Katherine's version wasn't written down for decades. It lived in her head, and each child remembered it slightly differently. Some swore she added a little molasses. Others insisted she used evaporated milk. The truth is that her pies changed a little depending on what the family could afford. That's part of why no official Jackson family sweet potato pie ever appeared in cookbooks or interviews. It wasn't a polished recipe. It was a mother stretching ingredients during hard years, turning them into something warm and filling. By the time Michael built Neverland, the pie was linked more to memory than routine, but he talked about it often during the holidays. It reminded him of everything he tried to recreate for others: belonging, warmth, and moments that felt slow and gentle. Number 3, Jackson family hot chocolate pudding cups. Picture the Jacksons in the early years, long before private chefs and tour buses with full kitchens. The family was traveling from city to city in cramped vans, moving between small apartments and motels that never felt like home. Christmas during those times looked different. The decorations were simple. The gifts were modest. But there was one dessert that showed up no matter where they spent the holiday: hot chocolate pudding cups. They weren't fancy. They weren't even a traditional recipe. They were a product of improvisation, the kind families made when budgets were tight, but everyone still wanted something warm and sweet for Christmas. Katherine used simple grocery store ingredients she could find anywhere: cocoa powder, cornstarch, sugar, a splash of milk, and whatever toppings were available. She cooked the mixture in a small pot right on the motel's plug-in kitchenette, stirring until it thickened into something smooth and comforting. For Michael and his siblings, those pudding cups became one of the earliest traveling traditions. Each child had a favorite way to eat theirs. Tito wanted extra cocoa. Marlon liked his with marshmallows when they could find them. Michael preferred it still warm, eaten with a plastic spoon that bent under the steam. The dessert didn't last long, but it warmed the room in a way no heater could. It mattered because the family was constantly on the road during those years. Their early rise in Motown meant long winter drives, rehearsals that ran late into the night, and Christmas celebrations squeezed between performances. There were times when the holiday felt like another workday, but the pudding cups gave them a moment to slow down and feel like a family again. For the kids, it was a reminder that even in the middle of fame, Christmas could still taste simple. The twist comes from how easily this dessert disappeared from the Jackson family story. As the group became more successful, their holidays changed. They stayed in nicer hotels. They spent more time in studios. Chefs prepared meals instead of Katherine using motel burners. The pudding cups faded into memory, overshadowed by bigger celebrations and more elaborate holiday spreads. None of the siblings ever publicly mentioned the dessert, and no formal recipe survived. It lived only in small recollections shared by a few relatives who remembered those early cross-country Christmas seasons. That's part of why the pudding cups feel so nostalgic now. They represent a moment when the Jacksons were still holding everything together with hope, talent, and a lot of sacrifice. Christmas was humble, but it was theirs, and those simple pudding cups, made in small kitchens across America, carried a warmth that stayed with Michael long after life took him far from those early roads. Number 4. The 1970s Motown gingerbread loaf. Walk into any Motown studio in the early 1970s, and you'd hear music pouring from every room, engineers shouting notes through intercoms, and somewhere in the background, the soft, sweet smell of gingerbread drifting from a corner table. That's the scent Michael remembered most during those long winter recording sessions. The Motown gingerbread loaf wasn't an official studio snack, but it was always there, wrapped in wax paper or sliced onto paper plates, waiting for artists and staff who needed a break from the intense hours of rehearsing and producing. Michael discovered it during one of his first Christmas seasons in Detroit. Someone from the Motown office, different people insist on different names, brought in a homemade gingerbread loaf that tasted nothing like the boxed mixes he'd seen back home. This one was darker, richer, heavy with molasses and warm spices. A thick glaze soaked into the top, turning the crust into something sticky and comforting. Michael loved it so much that whenever he smelled gingerbread afterward, he said it reminded him of those early studio winters. This dessert mattered because those years were a whirlwind. The Jackson Five were everywhere: magazine covers, TV specials, rehearsals that stretched past midnight. For a kid trying to navigate fame, the holiday season could easily blur into the work schedule. That gingerbread loaf gave him a tiny pocket of normalcy. In a place built on perfection, it tasted homemade and imperfect. He often grabbed a slice between takes, sometimes eating it with a cup of milk handed to him by a studio assistant who tried to make the young performers feel at least a little grounded. But the twist comes from how quickly this little tradition disappeared. When the Jacksons eventually left Motown and moved to Los Angeles, the studio routines changed. The Detroit winters were replaced with California sunshine. The staff who brought homemade baked goods didn't travel with them. And the gingerbread loaf, so tied to those early years, never showed up in quite the same way again. There were attempts to recreate it later. Bakers tried, chefs at Neverland tried, even a couple of Motown veterans tried to remember the original recipe, but no one could match the taste. The loaf had been a product of a specific moment in time: cold Detroit holidays, long studio nights, and the energy of a label that shaped American music. That's what makes this dessert so nostalgic today. It wasn't part of the Jackson family cookbook. It wasn't served at their home. It lived inside the walls of a legendary building during a legendary era, a humble treat that found its way into one of the busiest Christmas seasons of Michael's young life. Number 5, Neverland white chocolate snow truffles. Imagine arriving at Neverland Ranch in December. Lights wrapped around every tree, carolers by the gates, the sound of laughter drifting from the courtyard. And just inside the main house on a long display table dressed in white linen sat one of the ranch's most requested holiday treats, white chocolate snow truffles. They looked like tiny snowballs, chilled, smooth, and dusted with a soft coating that sparkled under the lights. Guests always assumed they came from some luxury bakery. In reality, they were made by a small team of pastry cooks who worked quietly behind the scenes to bring Michael's holiday visions to life. These truffles weren't part of Michael's childhood. They came out of his adult desire to build a holiday world that felt magical to anyone who walked through the ranch gates. He loved the idea of treats that felt whimsical, desserts that looked like they belonged in a storybook. The white chocolate snow truffles were exactly that, bite-sized, creamy, and finished with a hint of vanilla that made them melt instantly on the tongue. They were served during holiday charity events, winter tours of the property, and small December gatherings for staff and friends. They mattered because Neverland wasn't just a home. It was Michael's attempt to rebuild the childhood he felt he never had. Christmas at the ranch wasn't casual. It was intentional. He wanted guests, especially kids, to feel surrounded by joy from the moment they arrived. The truffles became a symbol of that effort. Staff members recalled that Michael would walk through the main house before events, checking decorations and asking whether the snow treats were out yet. It wasn't about luxury for him. It was about delight. The emotional twist came years later when the ranch's activity slowed and many longtime cooks moved on. The dessert was never formally written down. Each pastry cook made it slightly differently. Some used crushed vanilla cookies in the coating. Others added a faint orange note to the ganache. When Neverland eventually closed its doors and the staff dispersed, the recipe fragmented with them. No two versions matched exactly. What guests remembered most wasn't the flavor, but the feeling. Eating something cold and sweet while standing in a place designed to make the holiday season feel larger than life. That's why this dessert is considered lost now. Not because no one could make a white chocolate truffle, but because no one can recreate the experience of tasting them at Neverland during the holidays. The memory is tied to candlelit tours, artificial snow machines humming in the distance, and a host who wanted Christmas to feel magical for everyone else, even if he rarely slowed down to enjoy it himself. Number 6, the Victory Tour Peppermint Ice Cream Sandwiches. The 1984 Victory Tour was loud, massive, and relentless. Stadiums overflowing, cameras everywhere, crowds so big you could feel their roar even backstage. But tucked inside that high-pressure winter tour was a dessert nobody expected Michael to love: peppermint ice cream sandwiches. They weren't glamorous. They weren't served on silver trays. They came from a small touring kitchen the crew set up behind the stage, made by a caterer who realized that Michael needed something cool and refreshing during the late-night rehearsals leading up to the holiday shows. The sandwiches were simple: soft chocolate cookies, peppermint ice cream mixed with little shards of crushed candy cane, wrapped quickly in parchment so they wouldn't melt under the stage lights. Michael liked that they tasted like Christmas without feeling heavy. The show's schedule was so intense that most meals had to be light, quick, and easy to grab between costume changes. These ice cream sandwiches fit perfectly. Staff said he'd sometimes ask for one before the encore, just to cool down after performing under hot lights in layers of sequins and jackets. They mattered because the Victory Tour was one of the most demanding moments of Michael's career. The tour was enormous, with the entire Jackson family involved. Schedules shifted constantly. Press attention followed them everywhere. Holidays barely felt like holidays. Fans associated that era with explosive performances and groundbreaking showmanship. But behind the scenes, Michael was always trying to hold on to small pieces of normal life. Those peppermint sandwiches became a kind of ritual, one of the few reminders that December was still December, even when you were moving from stadium to stadium. The twist comes from how these sandwiches were created. They weren't part of any cookbook. They weren't a family recipe. They were invented on the spot by a catering team trying to keep a superstar energized during winter performances. The caterer responsible never shared the full recipe. Some versions from crew members say the cookies were baked soft on purpose so they'd bend instead of crack. Others swear they used homemade peppermint ice cream because store-bought melted too quickly under tour conditions. When the tour ended, so did the dessert. It was a moment in time creation tied to that specific crew and that specific winter. Years later, fans and even former staff tried recreating the treat, but no one could match the original texture or flavor. Maybe it was the setting. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was the strange mix of exhaustion and excitement that defined the victory tour. Whatever the reason, the dessert faded the moment the final show ended. That's what makes this Christmas recipe feel so lost today. It wasn't part of Neverland. It wasn't tied to Michael's childhood. It belonged to the backstage world most people never saw, a place where a peppermint ice cream sandwich could become a small source of comfort for someone carrying the weight of a global entertainment empire. Number 7, Grandma Rebby's brown sugar cornbread cake. If you trace Michael Jackson's Christmas memories back far enough, you eventually reach the South. His parents carried those traditions with them when they moved north, and some of the strongest came from the older generation, especially from Rebby, the eldest Jackson sibling, who learned a set of recipes that blended Southern comfort with everyday practicality. One of the quiet favorites was her brown sugar cornbread cake. It wasn't flashy or frosted. It looked a simple cornbread at first glance, but the moment you tasted it, you knew it was something else entirely. This dessert came from the old Southern practice of stretching ingredients. Families took cornbread, a staple, and sweetened it for holidays. Rebby added brown sugar, a little cinnamon, and sometimes a drizzle of warm cream over the top to give it a cake-like texture. She often baked it in a cast iron pan, the way older relatives taught her. That gave the edges a gentle crisp while the center stayed tender. When Michael was young, he loved that contrast. He liked desserts that felt homemade, the kind you could eat with your fingers while sitting at a crowded kitchen table. It mattered because this recipe offered something grounding during a childhood that didn't stay ordinary for long. By the time the Jackson kids were performing professionally, their holiday table didn't always stay the same. They celebrated in different cities, different houses, and eventually different countries. But whenever the family gathered at home, Rebby made this cornbread cake. There was no pressure around it, no special occasion air. It was the opposite of the extravagant treats Michael later served at Neverland. This was comfort food in the purest sense. The emotional twist comes from how easily this recipe could have vanished. Rebby wasn't one to write things down. She baked by eye, adding a spoonful of this or a handful of that. Her version changed depending on the year, the mood, or the ingredients she had. Some years it tasted more like cake. Other years it tasted more like cornbread with a caramel edge. Each sibling remembered it slightly differently, and because it wasn't part of the main holiday spread, it never became the kind of dish magazines asked the family about. By the time Michael was an adult, the dessert had turned into more of a memory than a regular holiday item. He mentioned it once or twice to close friends, saying it reminded him of the winters when all the siblings were still under one roof, before lives branched off in different directions. After that, the recipe faded. When family members tried recreating it later, they argued over details. Was it light brown sugar or dark? Did she add cream every year or only some years? Even the pan size changed in different retellings. That's what makes this dessert feel so nostalgic now. It's less about the recipe itself and more about the moment it belonged to. A time when the holidays meant everyone squeezed into a busy kitchen, passing plates, teasing each other, and relying on simple dishes that tasted like family. The lost caramel banana parfait. There was a stretch in Michael's life when bananas showed up in almost everything he enjoyed: smoothies, milkshakes, late night snacks, even backstage treats. So it's no surprise that during the holidays, someone in his kitchen started putting together a dessert that matched his favorite flavor with a Christmas twist: the caramel banana parfait. It wasn't a heavy holiday pie or a traditional cake. It was light, layered, and simple enough for Michael to enjoy without feeling weighed down during work-packed December weeks. This this parfait came together from a blend of influences. Southern families often used bananas in holiday puddings, and the Jacksons grew up eating versions of banana custards long before fame came along. But the Neverland version took things further. It was built in tall, clear glasses so the layers were easy to see: whipped cream, caramel drizzle, vanilla custard, and thin slices of fresh banana arranged in careful circles. Some versions included crushed vanilla wafers, others added a hint of cinnamon to give it a warm seasonal note. It wasn't meant to be glamorous, but it looked beautiful anyway. It mattered because it hit the center of Michael's personal taste. He leaned toward desserts that felt cool and creamy rather than dense or overly sweet. Staff members said he liked the texture, the freshness, the way it felt comforting without being heavy. It became one of the holiday desserts made just for him, not for guests, not for events, not for photo ops. When December rolled in, the kitchen automatically stocked more bananas, more cream, more caramel. It became part of the background rhythm of the season. The emotional twist comes from how quietly this dessert vanished. Unlike the grand treats served at Neverland events, the parfait wasn't documented. It didn't appear in photos or menus. It wasn't served to crowds. It was personal, almost private. After a few key staff members left the ranch, the dessert slipped from the routine. New chefs tried guessing at the recipe, but each version missed something: either too much caramel, or bananas sliced too thick, or custard that didn't set the same way. Once Neverland began to wind down and Michael's life shifted into new chapters, this small holiday tradition faded almost instantly. No one talked about it publicly. No cookbook recorded it. It survived only memories shared by a handful of people who worked in the kitchen during the late 80s and early 90s. That's what makes it a true lost Christmas recipe. Not because the ingredients were rare, but because the moment that gave it meaning disappeared. Today, the caramel banana parfait feels like a glimpse into the quieter side of Michael's holidays. A dessert made not for spectacle, but for comfort. Something enjoyed in the stillness after rehearsals, sitting near a window while winter lights glowed across the ranch. Number 9. LA Studio Cinnamon Sugar Donut Bites. There's something unmistakable about Los Angeles in the 1980s. The recording studios were always buzzing. Musicians drifted in and out at all hours. Assistants carried stacks of tapes down hallways lit by fluorescent panels. And in the middle of all that sound and motion, a small bakery in Studio City delivered something that quietly became one of Michael's favorite holiday treats: cinnamon sugar donut bites. These weren't the kind of donuts you'd find in a big box. They were made fresh every morning and dropped off at studios during December because the owners knew that holiday sessions ran long and musicians often skipped meals. The donut bites were small enough to pop in your mouth between takes, rolled in warm cinnamon sugar, and still soft on the inside. They came in paper bags that smelled so strong the entire mixing room would fill with the scent the moment someone opened one. Michael discovered them during late night sessions in the mid-80s, while recording tracks that would become some of the most recognizable songs of the decade. Holidays in those years didn't slow the schedule down. December looked exactly like July, except with more decorations in the hallways and a few strings of lights taped to the console. But those donut bites added just enough holiday flavor to remind everyone what time of year it really was. They mattered because this period was intense. Studio time stretched into sunrise. Songs were created piece by piece, with Michael often returning to the same vocal line dozens of times until it felt just right. Breaks were short, meals were even shorter. These donut bites became the thing that lifted the room. A little warmth, a little sweetness, a moment of comfort during a season when work easily swallowed the days. The emotional twist comes from what happened to that little bakery. By the early 2000s, it closed quietly after decades in business. The owners retired, the building was renovated, the original recipes vanished with them. No one saved the donut bite formula. Even longtime studio staff couldn't recreate the exact texture. Some said the bakery used a special blend of flours. Others insisted the secret was frying them twice. But the truth is that the recipe was never public, never written down, and never duplicated. And once the bakery disappeared, so did the holiday deliveries. Newer studios didn't have the same traditions. Younger caterers brought different snacks. By then, Michael had moved on from that phase of his recording life, and those cinnamon-sugared donut bites turned into nothing more than a warm memory connected to nights filled with creative energy and holiday lights strung loosely across mixing boards. That's why this treat feels so nostalgic now. It wasn't part of Neverland. It wasn't part of Katherine's kitchen or the Jackson family table. It belonged to the rhythm of Los Angeles recording culture during a golden era. A bite-sized reminder that even during some of the most productive years of his career, Michael still found comfort in something small, sweet, and tied to the holiday season. Number 10, the European mulled apple tart. During the height of his global touring years, Michael spent a series of winters in Europe. Cold train platforms, snow-covered plazas, and Christmas markets lit with strings of golden lights became familiar sights. On one of those trips, he tasted a dessert that stayed with him for years, the mulled apple tart. It came from a small bakery near a market square, where the smell of hot spices drifted through the air every December. The tart was simple, rustic, and so warm it felt like it melted winter right off your shoulders. The dessert blended familiar flavors with something new. The apples were cooked slowly with cloves, nutmeg, and orange zest, the same spices used in European mulled wine. They were spooned into a flaky crust and glazed with a thin layer of spiced syrup that gave the tart a glossy finish. Michael loved the balance: warm fruit, soft pastry, and a scent that reminded him of the market's crowded walkways. For someone who spent much of his life in hotel rooms, that tart felt grounded, almost like it tied him to the season in a new way. It mattered because touring life rarely allowed space to enjoy local traditions. Days were booked hour by hour. Nights were filled with performances. Cities blurred together. But that afternoon in the Christmas market was one of the rare moments when Michael could simply wander, blend in, and enjoy something without cameras or crowds. The bakery didn't know who he was. They served him the same tart they served every customer. That anonymity made the experience feel even more special. The emotional twist comes from what happened afterward. Michael tried several times to have the dessert recreated back home. Chefs experimented with spice blends. Some versions came close, but none captured the exact flavor. The bakery that made the tart eventually closed. European markets changed over time. The original recipe disappeared. Local residents remembered the shop, but no one could agree on the spice ratios or the method used to prepare the apples. It was another holiday moment lost to time, the kind you can only experience once. Years later, when Michael talked about his travels, he mentioned the tart more than once, not by name, but by memory. He described the smell of cinnamon and citrus in the air, the rush of cold wind when he stepped outside, and the warmth of the dessert in his hands. That memory stayed vivid even as tours took him to different continents and different holiday seasons. Today, the mulled apple tart represents a quieter chapter in his holiday story, a moment when the world slowed just long enough for him to taste something simple and comforting in the middle of a whirlwind career. Looking back at these desserts, you start to realize they were never just sugar and flour. They told the story of a boy who grew up too fast and spent the rest of his life searching for pieces of the childhood he missed. Christmas gave him that chance, a chance to slow down, to sit at the table, to smell something familiar in the oven, and feel, if only for a moment, like the world wasn't watching. Each recipe carried a memory, a lesson from his mother, a tradition he tried to pass to his own children, a taste that reminded him of who he was before fame shaped everything around him. And in a way, revisiting these dishes lets us see the person behind the legend a little more clearly. The lights, the stadiums, the records, all of it made him global. But these quiet, warm traditions made him grounded. They connected him to family, to the holidays he cherished, and to the parts of his life he kept closest. So as we close this journey through the desserts he loved most, we're left with something simple, a reminder that even the biggest stars look for comfort in the same places we do. In the kitchen, around a table, with the tastes and smells that make us feel at home.